Welcome to the second episode in the Neil Davis series. We can be found on Facebook, which is facebook.com/Oz War History, and we're also on Patreon if you'd like to support us in the endeavour of creating this podcast. Thank you very much for listening.
And just another little phase that showed this tenacity and this grit. He tore a lateral cartilage in his right knee while playing football. And, you know, this is the 1950s. Cartilage operations were not common in the 1950s, and he put it off for 3 years. I mean, these days, you get Nick Naitanui. He suffered 2 ACL injuries, spent a full year out for each of them, so out for 2 years. But he was back at it. So he was out for 2 years. But Davis got back to this Dr. Douglas Parker, who, remember, we said he was an orthopedic surgeon, and he agreed to perform the operation. And he told Davis he could play football again in a few months. True to form, Davis commented, "I was determined to play earlier than that. To ensure that happened, he would exercise fanatically for 8 hours a day." 8 hours a day. God, amazing. And Parker put his foot down and said, "You are only allowed to exercise 8 hours," because he kind of knew that if there was no boundary there, Davis would continue to push himself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Well, it is.
Yeah.
I mean, that capacity, you know, if only more people had that sense of, yep, I'm going to beat this. It's not going to beat me. We just often, it's too much, you know. We farm out all our problems to other people, government. They need to go, instead of saying, hey, this is my problem. I own it. I'm going to get out of it. So it teaches us things about how we ought to run our lives. And in fact, after this operation on his knee, 6 weeks after, he was playing football. Now, you know, you just think, God. But kind of part of this recovery, it's worth mentioning, he took up professional running to recover from the operation. So, you know, there's all these little things he did to make sure he recovered quickly. He would spend hours running not in the sand, but in the water. And he did so to make sure he would raise his knees up high, which is the classic movement of a good runner. And he also stressed the importance of relaxation in competing. It's so important. I remember, get back to Shane Warne, I remember him saying that you get your best out of yourself as a sportsman when you're having fun. And when you're having fun, you're relaxed. You're not continually trying to do stuff. You know, you're not tensing up. And I thought, yeah, that makes sense. And I remember an interview, it was at Olympic Games, and there was a 100-metre sprint event. So, you know, it's the one that requires strength. And there was this interview, and he walked up to this bloke in a yoga pose, one of the sprinters in a yoga pose. And this reporter said, what are you doing? You're supposed to be revved up. You've got the 100-metre event. It needs strength and power. You know, it needs for you to be kind of ready for it, you know, tight. And the guy said, no. He said, the exact opposite is true. He said, when my body is relaxed, that's when I get the best out of myself. This sense of free movement, this free flowing quality, when you are relaxed, allows you to perform at your best.
Yeah.
So he believed in that. Sorry, yeah.
Just saying, like, when I did all the martial arts training, like, one of the things that was drilled into me quite heavily, even by, like, Simon, is that you can't be tense in any fight. No. You have to always be relaxed. And because of that, you're able to respond quicker.
Yes.
And the response is always really important. And the quicker the response, the better.
Yeah.
And if you're tense and you can't throw punches as good, they won't connect as good. You might pull them at the last moment because you're not in the moment, if you know what I mean. So I definitely agree with that. And then the other thing I'm just thinking about this guy is he always puts himself in the situations where he has to perform.
Yes.
You know, he takes that professional running. So he's putting himself in a spot where he can't get out of it almost, if you know what I mean. And then the professional football, and then...
Oh, yes, a series of challenges.
With the polio, he's like, 3 weeks. He's like, he can't get himself out of it, if you know what I mean. So he's setting himself up to win, you know.
Win.
And,
because he believed he would win, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, to go back to that punching business, I mean, you have to look at the little phrase that Ali made famous, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. And that's what, if you look at him in his fights, he used to float around the ring. He'd be floating and jabbing, and then he'd float back and then sting like a bee. And poor old George Foreman and Brazier felt those stings.
They found out.
They found out about the stings.
It's actually interesting. We watched this boxing match between these two strong men. Like they were 2017, 2018 winners of the World's Strongest Man.
Oh, okay.
So one's like 6'8", 150 kilos. Yes. Another one's 6'3" and 150 kilos.
Right.
One trained with a professional boxer, all the technique and everything else, and the other guy just they didn't like each other, so this is why they're having the boxing match.
Yes.
And the other guy was trying to knock him out. So he kept throwing these big haymaker swings.
Yes.
And after the second round, he was done.
Yeah.
Tense,
That's
all
right.
the wrong footing, everything else.
Yeah.
Was trying to just knock him out, whereas the other guy was relaxed.
Yeah.
Just supple, taking advantage of when the guy stuffed up and got tired, and he won.
Yeah.
He won.
Well, that's a rumble in the jungle, That's the same. It's got what Ali used. It's called rope-a-dope, and Ali just put his arms up around his head, his fists around his head, and just allowed George Foreman to punch himself, kind of, almost as though he had no energy at the end, and that's what happened. And as soon as Ali sensed that Foreman had exhausted himself with all these punches to the head and the body, and he kept absorbing it all, and then bang, and Foreman went down. So rope-a-dope.
Yeah.
In fact, so much so that with running, he said, if someone asked me, what would you like to do if you weren't a foreign correspondent or a cameraman? And he said, my immediate answer would be, I'd love to train runners. So there's an interesting little insight, training runners, Kind of this avoidance of running in the sand was certainly not the approach of Percy Cerruti. He's one of our famous trainers. He championed a Spartan approach to athletics. He was amazingly eccentric, this Cerruti. He believed in natural vegan diets, hard training through sandhills, reading poetry and philosophy, and lifting weights. Interesting kind of
sounds like
training mix. Yeah, no, that's right, exactly. Yeah, he avoided the track, and he talked about role models outside of athletics like Leonardo da Vinci and Jesus Christ. And the proof of his methods was in the pudding, so to speak. And that was one of his most amazing successes. Was one of Australia's greatest athletes, Herb Elliott. He blitzed the field in the 1500 metres race, the 1960 Rome Olympic Games, and this Percy Cerruti would push Elliott to his absolute limits by insisting he sprint up sandhills until he dropped. And this occurred he had this training school at Portsea. Cerruti would say, faster! It's only pain. It's only pain. Oh, that's not a bad little philosophy.
Yeah.
Forget about it. It's only pain.
It's only pain.
It's only pain.
Go away.
But he also trained Betty Cuthbert, one of our great runners, John Landy, who recently died, and the boxer Jimmy Carruthers. And John Landy and Roger Bannister and Wes Santee. Wes Santee was the British runner, and Roger Bannister was the English runner, and John Landy the Australian runner. They were all three of them were trying to break this 4-minute mile barrier, which roughly translates to 15 miles per hour, or 24 kilometres an hour. And they kind of got to 4 minutes and 2 seconds, and they just couldn't reduce it. And they kept thinking, no one is going to ever break this 4-minute barrier. And they kept at it, and it was 6 months. All three of them were trying to break this kind of barrier, 4-minute barrier. But eventually, as history records, Bannister and two other athletes, a Chris Brasher and a Chris Chataway, they broke the holy grail of athletics with a time of 3 minutes 59.4 seconds. And Chataway and Brasher were used as windbreaks and paces to spur Bannister on the track, and he broke the record at Oxford and made 6:9:54. It's funny, as soon as the record was broken, 2 months later, after this breaking the record, John Landy reappears. He reduced the time even further, downwards to 3 minutes and 58 seconds. So it just needed that breakthrough, and then it all...
Floodgates are open.
That's right, the floodgates open, yeah.
It's like going back to the strongman thing again.
I love
watching strongman.
Oh, no, why not? I do too. Yeah, I do too.
And one bloke, Eddie Hall, he said he's going to lift 500 kilos as a deadlift. And that's with wraps and a suit.
Yes.
So And he did all this training, and the day came and he nailed it. He lifted the 500 kilos. Nobody thought anyone could ever lift 500 kilos.
Right.
You know, it was like 480, maybe 485, 490.
They're insurmountable things, supposedly.
It's insurmountable. Yeah,
supposedly.
He went out there and did it.
Yeah.
And then like 6 months later, a bloke, one of this rival of his who he boxed as a bit of a FGE to him, he lifted 501, and he lifted it like it was nothing. He just lifted it. It
psychology, isn't it?
Yeah,
psychology.
Yeah. Once someone had done it, like, I can do it. 500 kilos.
Well, it's a fair lift, isn't it?
Yeah.
Fair lift. But I just say, when I'm looking at this tenacity and this never say die attitude of Davis, I just can't help but reflect on some of the youth of today. Now, look, I know we've got, there's it's a bit of a generalisation, but I'll say that anyway. Unfortunately, we're breeding a bit of a soft and selfish generation, content to curl up underneath the blankets, wondering if the smashed avocado will be to their liking when they decide to emerge from their cocoon for breakfast. Is this smashed avocado going to be good enough? What's happened to us? This amazing Australian larrikin spirit, it's been crushed or something's gone.
Replaced by avocado.
Yeah, that's right.
That's gold.
Back to Davis, because he's the bloke we're talking about.
Yeah.
So, but he showed great aptitudes at school in other subjects. He topped his classes in primary school, but he was bored with the traditional English style curriculum that was the kind of case in Tasmania. And he said he claimed to learn more about English and American history rather than about the narratives surrounding Australia. As well, other things got in the way of his education. At the age of 14, a sudden surge in adolescent hormones diverted his attention from school. Women, girls, the very thing that became a lifelong obsession with him, they began to assume paramount importance. And it's so much so that in one of his years, he failed 7 out of his 12 subjects in 1 year. His mind was on other things. But and there was another disturbing factor getting in the way. Now, it was that Errol Flynn, one of the great Hollywood rabble rousers, and we've got this phrase in Australia, in like Flynn. I won't go into details, but it's talking about how much of a great Lothario Don Juan Errol Flynn was. But he actually came from the same school as Davis, Hobart High School. Room 11 was very important because apparently in room 11, Errol Flynn had carved his name in the desk. There it was. And so all the boys would rush into room 11 to sit at this desk that had the carving of his name. And it's like, I'm absorbing something.
Rubbing the Buddha's belly to get, more money.
More luck or, something that he had coming my way. Yeah. And Davis was part of them. There were all these aspiring Romeos wanted the magic that Errol Flynn had. Yeah. On a more serious note, he left school at 14 and to work at the Tasmanian Government Film Unit and acquired the basics of photography using traditional flash powder, and he was making 35mm segments for Cinesound Productions. The film was very scarce back then and very expensive, but he learned to be very economical, and he learned to edit in the camera itself, and that it meant that kind of was able to process film very easily, and it was very good in the early stages of Vietnam. All these skills he learned in Tasmania in this film unit came into great use when he was in Vietnam.
One of the things that I read, because I wasn't going to read it, I was listening to the audiobook, but you're saying that a lot of the American photojournalists didn't have those issues with the costs and everything else for the film.
Right.
So they were just filming everything.
Yes.
And one of the main differences between him and them was because it's so scarce, he had to take good photos.
Yes.
And notice when photos, there was the right opportunity to take them.
Yeah.
And, so he was always looking for them.
Yeah.
Whereas the Americans were just always filming, not looking.
Ooh.
So that was part of one of the reasons why he was so good. And all of his documentation process that he had as well. With writing down where he took the photo, the time, the place, and everything else like that. Whereas, again, the Americans, they didn't have that.
No.
Some did, and some didn't. But that was the thing that set him apart as well, which is really cool. So.
Yeah. So we've got to be economic. So you can embellish too much stuff. Often simplicity is the best thing with stories. When stories are nice and simple, and they're accessible to the smartest and the not so smartest. And he was good at telling good, simple, economical, taut stories through the camera. Very good at it.
Yeah.
In 1961, he left the Tasmanian government film unit, searching for new opportunities. And that, once again, that road less travelled by comes into it. He wasn't content to be where he was. He had to search elsewhere. And he became the Australian Broadcasting Commission's first cine cameraman. He stayed with the ABC for 3 years, but newer pastures beckoned once again. The road less travelled by. And there were kind of things in his personal life which were, that were important. He said, Davis admitted that his love life had reached the doldrums, and he was searching for a powerful wind current to steer him in another direction. And he said, before I left Tasmania in 1964, I was engaged 2, maybe 3 times. They were nice girls, and there was no reason why I shouldn't have married any of them. He says, I suppose in the back of my mind was that uncertainty, a subconscious feeling that I would leave Tasmania and Australia. So he sensed already, back that he was destined for bigger and better things. And so he didn't hitch himself up to kind of, I won't say mediocrity, because marriage just doesn't mean that you become mediocre. But, I think for him, such a trailblazer, staying in Tasmania would have
seemed that way.
Definitely. It's 1964 and Southeast Asia is on the cusp of the huge ructions that would occur a little later in August with the Gulf of the Tonkin incident that allowed the Americans to enter the war. And so Davis accepts a job as a cameraman and a correspondent based in Singapore. So he makes the break from Australia and goes to Singapore, that step into the unknown, that road we kept talking about. So he left Australia in February 1964 and landed at Paya Lebar Airport. And that was the airport that was kind of that serviced the greater Singapore. These days it's Changi. We know that. And, really, the Singaporeans are so well organised. They're amazing with their sense of organisation. Changi Airport really has a very dark connection with World War II and the fall of Singapore on the 15th of February 1942. Now, Singapore was considered by the British military planners as the Gibraltar of the East. It was very, very important, foremost in their thinking, the main military port in that region, Southeast Asia. So there was fighting in Singapore from February the 8th to the 15th in 1942, and unfortunately was the greatest military debacle suffered by the British in the early stages of World War II. And we think back to Timor. February the 19th, 1942, they were attacked at Timor, but so this is February the 8th, so a week or so, close to 2 weeks. Before that, the Singapore was threatened. And really, they probably should have held Singapore. But, just previous to that, you have a terrible blow in December 41, where the battleship Prince of Wales, British battleships, the Prince of Wales and the battle cruiser Repulse, were attacked by land-based bombers and torpedo bombers from the Japanese Imperial Navy. It was a telling blow to Allied forces in the Pacific as, Pearl Harbor had just been kind of obliterated, destroyed just 3 days earlier on December the 10th, December the 7th, 1941. So it's not a great start for the British or the Americans in the Pacific. So then you've got the Battle of Singapore. The Japanese general, now I've got to be very careful with the way I say this, Yamashita. I think that's the pronunciation. I'll do so, mate. Maybe thinking, I've got this wrong.
Yeah.
But he was advancing south with about 30,000 men down the Malayan Peninsula, and many strategists believed that the jungle passage south was impassable. And I think we might have mentioned before with the Timor thing that some of his troops were on bicycles. You can kind of imagine kind of the response of British troops. "Oh, I say, good fellow, I think we can see some yellow gentlemen on bicycles. They seem harmless enough. Goodness gracious, they're a long way from Tokyo. A bit further than a casual morning cycle to lift the spirits. Eh, what? Golly gosh, they've got some rifles with them. Jolly unfriendly, I'd say." So you can imagine these poor bombs seeing these Japanese soldiers.
Yeah.
They're on bicycles. They almost probably fell over and, couldn't survive, Anyway.
Have to drink a bit more tonic and get on with it.
Have a cup of tea and see if we can get over this. So anyway, after some incredible bluffing by, here's this Japanese general again, Yamashita. Yamashita bluffed the British Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, and Percival surrendered, even though the British had significant numerical and positional advantages over the Japanese. The only problem was all of their water was drawn from the reservoirs on the mainland, so the water was the problem. You can imagine in a tropical climate, having access to water. The Japanese aircraft bombed the existing water supplies. And I think Percival thought, no water, we're gone. We're not going to survive an onslaught from the Japanese. But the island was so important that the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, said he ordered Percival to fight to the last man. Here we are, fight to the last man. And it seems that there weren't too many men in the upper echelons of the British High Command in Singapore because they surrendered very easily. So, Yamashita, once again, our mate with the unusual name, demanded unconditional surrender to avoid house-to-house fighting. And Percival threw in the towel, and many of those who were involved in the capitulation were interred in the infamous Changi prison. It was a dark day for Australians and British soldiers who were ordered to surrender. About 80,000 British, Indian and Australian troops became prisoners of war. Many died of neglect, abuse or forced labour. Churchill called it the worst disaster in British military history, the fall of Singapore. And they were dark days for the British and the Americans. Those early years, from that to about end of 42, when they started to have some success in the Middle East. But for a long while there, the war was looking as though, the Germans would triumph. But you can actually visit, back to Singapore, you can actually visit the Changi Museum. It's a harrowing journey to wander through all the exhibits dealing with the barbaric treatment of the PMWs. There are about 850 POWs died during their internment in Changi. Apparently it was quite a low rate compared to the overall death rate of 27% for POWs in Japanese camps. Many more, however, died after being transferred from Changi to various labour camps outside Singapore, including those on the Burma Railway and Sandakan airfield. So back to this kind of Davis, and it's the end of the Singapore thing. He arrived in Singapore at this Paya Lebar airport, and all these exotic smells and the humidity and the enticing sights confronted Davis, and he was overwhelmed by its powerful sensuality. And they got the aromas of clove-scented cigarettes, and the throng of people at the airport would have excited Davis, and in fact it did. He said, for an Aussie boy, especially an islander from Tasmania, I thought I might as well have landed on another planet. So
would have seemed that way.
Yeah, would have. No, well, that's right. Here he is. He's branching out into, a kind of a new world. So it was this kind of fork in his life journey, the road less travelled by. But he was in, and it's the beginning, the Singapore thing. He stayed there for a while, and then he was transferred to Saigon, late 64. But he was in for a bumpy but an exhilarating ride. And so here we are, this point there. Vietnam War is about to kind of unfold, and then we've got Neil Davis right at the centre of it, and thank goodness there's the bloke of his psychological capacity and physical fitness, and we're in for a great little story. I reckon it's fantastic what happens hereafter. Anyway, here we are, end of episode 1, and episode 2 is Vietnam.
Yeah, nice. All right, well, thank you everyone for listening. Appreciate it. I don't know how we're going to release these segments. Whether we'll figure it out. We'll let you know anyway.
Yes.
And
because it's quite a long one, that first one, wasn't it? But anyway,
it was good.
Anyway, that's all right.
Probably my favourite one was the avocado.
Oh, right, the smashed avocados.
Should be something else, but that's what it is.
That's right. Yeah.